This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. Hello, I'm Stephen Coates, and here at the Bureau of Lost Culture, we're dedicated to collecting and recollecting half-remembered, half-forgotten countercultural stories, oral testimonies, tales from the underground and beyond, and celebrating rare audio and those who have made it. And I think we have all of the above in this episode. If you want to check out all that we do and support us in our endeavours, go to bureauoflostculture.com. What you heard at the top was the song of a lavender seller, a traditional cry. It was sung by Robert Penfold of 148 Culvert Road, Battersea, London, SW11. London is a mercantile city, and the cries of street traders were long considered emblematic of its spirit. They were mentioned in the works of many authors, including Ben Jonson, Thomas Browne, Jonathan Swift, and Charles Dickens. Street selling was in decline by the early 20th century, and when something's about to vanish, belated appreciation for it often blossoms all of a sudden in the halls of high culture. The street cries which were most successful in gaining such approval were those of violet sellers and lavender sellers. And that recording was from the BBC archive, dated the 2nd of November 1938. It was digitised and collected, and the words that I read were by Ian Rawes as part of his epic London Sound Survey. The Song of the Lavender Seller was one of Ian's favourite recordings. Ian died last year, and this episode of the Bureau is, in his honour, a kind of commemoration or celebration of him and his work. And I'm joined to celebrate Ian and his work by his friend, advocate and sometimes tenant, Tony Herrington, the writer and publisher of The Wire magazine. We're going to talk about Ian, about the London Sound Survey, about soundtracking the city, the cultural underground, and Tony's own work at The Wire. So here we go. Welcome, Tony.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you for having me on the show.
For anybody who doesn't know you, and if anybody doesn't know The Wire, give us a quick bio.
The Wire is an independent music magazine. Formed in 1982, it started out mostly covering like avant-garde jazz, improvised music, experimental music. Over the years, it's kind of expanded that remit to cover underground music, adventurous music of all types, the monthly print magazine with all the usual add-ons, websites. And I'm the publisher now. I've been various things. I was a contributor, deputy editor, editor-in-chief, and then I demoted myself to publisher, so that's what I do now.
Poacher turned gamekeeper, as we say.
Kind of. So I've been around at The Wire for 30-odd years.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the anniversary. I was just going to read a little bit from what it says on the site about it, because it's what you just said and more, but I love this. The Wire celebrates and interrogates the most visionary and inspiring, subversive and radical, marginalised and undervalued musicians on the planet, past and present. And it goes on, passionate, intelligent and provocative, wages war on the mundane and the mediocre. This show, the Bureau of Lost Culture, is largely dedicated to countercultural stories. And of course, one of the things that comes up quite often is the independent press. We always talk about IT and Oz and Friends and all that sort of stuff. And when I was reading that about The Wire, I suddenly thought, wow, actually, The Wire is the countercultural press in a way, isn't it?
Well, I guess it grew out of that initially. So in the UK in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a kind of countercultural press underneath or subterranean to the kind of national music press everyone knows about, like the NME, Melody Maker, Sounds and all that. There was these other magazines called things like Musics and Impetus and Collusion. And these were underground press, small press, kind of not quite fanzines, but not quite your standard kind of newsstand magazine. But they were covering all the stuff that maybe the weeklies never did. And The Wire very much kind of grew out of that kind of ferment in London in the late 70s.
And what's important, I mean, I imagine gives you some degree of satisfaction is that a lot of those big music papers, NME, Melody Maker, have been around. Melody Maker have run for a very long time. I mean, they're kind of gone. I mean, they sort of exist in some ghostly form, don't they? But I mean, in terms of sense of print, they've gone. Whereas The Wire is flourishing, right?
Yeah, they've all gone by the wayside. Usually because of lack of faith in the companies that publish them. You know, if things start to get tight, it's always the knee-jerk response to go to the lowest common denominator, rather than look at what you've got and try and kind of push. What makes you unique and special compared to all the other stuff out there. But obviously the onslaught of online culture has kind of decimated the print industry, if you like. But there's still huge amounts of print out there. You just got to walk into any shop. There's so many small press type journals and all kinds of stuff going on now still. It's not as influential as it maybe once was, but it's still a huge amount of activity bubbling under.
Is there a counterculture still? Is it there in those small publications when it comes to press? I mean, what does it mean to you now? You're probably better placed than most to know whether there's countercultural music going on. I mean, it's come up several times here that in some ways it's probably out there, out of sight, flourishing or starting to come out of the ground somewhere. I always say this, maybe in South London off Upper Tower Block or something, or, we don't notice it somehow, do we, until it's already above ground.
Once upon a time, if you wanted to hear stuff that was not, kind of mainstream Radio 1 playlist stuff, you would have to really go deep and dig it out. But now, obviously, through the internet, there's so many online stations and other kind of outlets, let alone all the streaming services. Things do have platforms now. There is an infrastructure there to support and promote, if you want to call it that, music that previously you would have said was underground or experimental or avant-garde or whatever. So they do have their platforms now. In a way, it makes it less heroic, less interesting. It feels less like you're, thrashing your way through the jungle, sort of clearing the ground or whatever. There's kind of different ideas and approaches to music, not just music, but everything can kind of be disseminated and people can find a voice. But the clamour, the babble of those voices, I think makes it even, obviously, difficult to cut through very often.
I'm glad you used that phrase, babble of voices. That's a perfect segue in what we're about to listen to.
Yeah, those cushions. These are the animal shookies there. Animal ones are 8. The ones along there, the medium ones, they're all 6. Alright, shooky, cushions there, look. There, your shookies there, look. Clear them out. £3. Anyone got £3? For them, go and have a little nice shirt type food for them.
Any 2 for 5 or 5 for 10 girls? Come on, ladies!
I'm coming now. Okay, 1 second. I'm coming now. Finish? 5, 2, right back. 5, 10, 20. 20 pounds. Give me 10 pounds. Give me 10 pounds. Give me 20, 10 pounds. 10 pounds. Very cheap. Because this 5, 10. And this 5, 10, 20 pounds. Give me 10 pounds.
This 5 is 7 pounds.
How much is the color? £7.50.
What we heard then was a recording called Petticoat Lane Traders. For anybody who doesn't know, Petticoat Lane, it's in the east bit of London. It's a traditional London market. Still is, largely, despite the sort of hipsterisation of East London. It's still a place where you can buy spent batteries and out-of-date copies of The Wire, I imagine, for £1 and that sort of stuff. And it was recorded by Ian Rawes. And the reason that Tony's here is to talk about Ian Rawes and his amazing project, countercultural project, I would say, London Sound Survey. Last year, a friend of mine just happened to mention that Ian had died, which was a big shock because he wasn't very old. And Tony's obituary of him appeared in The Wire shortly afterwards. And I wanted just to read a little bit from that before we talk about him and why he mattered. So Ian Rawes launched the London Sound Survey in 2009 as a platform for his field recordings of London street life, which he'd started making the previous year. The first was at Petticoat Lane Market in London's East End. I wanted to do something to understand this city, he said, to produce my own version of it that other people could read or respond to. Aspects of London that appealed to me most, which tended to be the more humble, down-to-earth things, such as street markets, junk shops, old man's pubs, canals, odd places and so on. A kind of worm's eye view of the city. Tony, he was a friend of yours. You wrote about him. You mentioned earlier he was your landlord. I think we'll come back to that in a minute. But who was Ian and what is the London Sound Survey?
Yeah, I guess it's like one man's Quixotic life project, to document as much of London in sound as he could possibly get. I mean, as a website, it's a model website. I mean, Ian also had a background in kind of typography and graphic design, and you can tell that by the website because it's beautifully made. It really kind of draws you in. So he was a friend of mine. He was my landlord. We can talk about that later. He started the London Sound Survey, as you just read out, in 2008 because he'd started making field recordings the previous year. And the one you just played, Petticoat Lane Market, I think that was an excerpt from the very first one that he did. I think that's the earliest recording on the site. And actually, I think that was the first time he went out of the house with a recording setup, a microphone, headphones, a recorder, etc., and walked around recording the sounds of the environments around him. And I think it was just born out of this kind of an innate curiosity. At the time, in the early to mid-2000s, he got a job at the National Sound Archive at the British Library. He was basically a storeman there, cataloguing all the items that either came in or that were held in the National Sound Archive, which are basically CDs, LPs, cassettes, etc., of all types of stuff, not just commercially released material, but all kinds of other material. And so, he would be cataloguing this stuff, lugging it around into boxes and such, and I believe he just started taking notice of some of the things that were there.
You said to me, I think earlier, that there was one particular sound or set of sounds that got Ian going in the first place. Is that right?
Yes. As I understand it, when he was working in the National Sound Archive, he started, taking notice of some of the things that he was actually cataloguing and such. And he said that basically the thing that got him interested in field recordings was there was a US field recordist, ethnomusicologist called Stephen Felt, who made recordings all over the world, Papua New Guinea, Accra, Ghana, and so on. But also made recordings across Europe of what he kind of called pastoral soundscapes, so rural soundscapes, many of which are dominated by the sound of bells. So if you think about rural communities in Greece, Italy, Albania, etc., there's the sound of church bells, but there's also these are farming communities, so they're farming cows, cattle, sheep, goats, etc. Very often they're kind of, scattered around hills and God knows what else. And of course they all have bells, they all wear bells around their necks, So this is a recording of all this, the sound of goats being herded through a village, and you can hear the sound of the bells going off, and you can hear the shepherds shouting, you can hear dogs barking, and you can understand how Ian might have heard that and thought, oh wow, I could do that. I could go out into Petticoat Lane Market where there's all these people shouting, there's dogs, there's people moving stuff about, I could record that.
on the site, the London Sound Service site, which is still up, it's over 2,000 recordings of everyday life in London, recorded over 10 years. But I mean, it's a sort of Quixotic is probably the word, isn't it, in a way? Because how can you possibly record, a city? You can only do these tiny little snapshots, right? But he did that, and other people have done it too. And the site also contains, historical recordings. We're going to hear some of those later, and some more of your choices. But why was it important? Why do you think it's important to have done that? What elevates it above one man's hobby, one man's kind of personal interest, into something which is counterculturally significant?
Well, obviously, in the first instance, it was just something that he actually enjoyed doing. He enjoyed going out into these places, wherever they were, recording them, the sound, getting the sound down, then building a website, like a sound map, so, where you could, if anyone who's interested, could go and start clicking on little sort of parts of London to throw up recordings that had been made there, either by Ian or other recordists that he included on the site, because he was very generous in that way, or, as you say, archive recordings which he pulled together from various sources, including the BBC archive, and then just put it there really without comment, and just left people make their own decisions or whatever, or responses to what this thing was. They can, obviously, recordings without being there looking, they can, they're abstracted into some other thing, so some of them become almost musical events themselves, divorced from their kind of original content.
I want to play one now, which is another one of your choices, actually, and it's just called Albert Basin. That actually sounds quite musical. I mean, it sounds, I think you said to me when you sent it me, sounds like sort of abstract drumming or something, right?
Ian did a lot of recording along the Thames and the various sort of little tributaries and rivers that run off the Thames. On the London Sound Survey website, there's at least a couple of sections devoted to recordings made around water. And obviously water is one of the river, the Thames itself, London built up around it. So rivers are key to the history of London, obviously, and many other great cities. But the Albert Basin is a kind of a part of the Thames. There were some boats, and I don't know what they're called, but it's basically bits of metal hanging off the masts of boats, and as the wind or the waves move, these things clatter against the masts in a way that is rhythmical, but actually, sounds to me very familiar. It sounds to me like I've sat in a room many times listening to free jazz or free music percussionists performing, and it sounds like that. I think that's a good example of what these kind of recordings can do. They can draw your attention to sound, and they can make you hear it in a way that if you were just walking past, you probably wouldn't. So that's another thing. It's about, maybe Ian would never claim such high kind of values for it, but I think maybe they're bringing attention to people, to make them more aware of their environment, to engage more with the environment rather than just passing through it, to actually stop and notice the sounds and accept all the stuff that's going on around them, and in that process maybe elevate your existence slightly, maybe improve your or maybe put another dimension on your relationship with the environment that you're moving through, and not just take all this stuff for granted.
It makes things a little bit magical or something in a way, because I think particularly in the age when we're all kind of glued to our phones and listening to stuff via the phones or whatever, via headphones. And then there is this kind of continual soundtrack going on out there, and particularly if you go a little bit out of the way. I wanted to read you what he says about that. By the dock gate stands a row of short aluminium flagpoles, and in windy weather the weighted halyards bang against them. The clicks and the clacks make a random koan onto the meaninglessness of which you can project whatever you like. But there's no power. Dereliction only happens in its absence, which is perhaps part of the consolation of such places. Everything round here is changing, and the flagpole will disappear, along with the wooden boardwalk nearby and its rotten-looking planks. I mean, he was quite a good writer.
Yeah,
as well,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, he kind of disavowed any kind of poetical or philosophical kind of notions relating to his work, but which was a bit disingenuous, because he was highly very political, and he was also, as you heard just then, he could philosophize about his work in ways that were really incredibly evocative, and also accurate, and kind of really bring you into why he was doing this kind of thing. But I think a lot of it, again, he was interested in the city, so he's a Londoner born and bred, and I think he was interested in the people who lived here. He was interested in the spaces that they occupied. He was interested in the way these things changed. He wasn't completely crestfallen by all the changes that have occurred in London over the last, let's say 30, 40 years or something, because that's how, that was his kind of lifespan in terms of an adult. So he was interested in it as a historical thing. So this is also a historical record, if you like, the changing sound of London, the changing face of London. And this was his medium to do that. Some people choose photography, some people write about it, or historians, but he was like a historian of sound or something. Sound was his medium to talk about London, the people who live in it, and how those things have changed over time, and the forces that are brought to bear upon them, whether they're economic, social, the changing kind of demographic of people who live in London. So yeah, sound was the way that he did that, and it was just his way of engaging with the city that he found really interesting. Otherwise I think he would have just become the pub bore, sitting in the corner.
He did like the pub. He was fond of the pub.
Well, another thing on the website, there are a couple of other sections on there, as you said when you were reading out. He liked the old London, if you want to put it that way. And he did, there are kind of eulogies to Greasy Spoon cafes on the London Sound Survey website. There's no sounds, but there's photographs, and he describes all the different Greasy Spoons that he used to go to. He liked old pubs that you could sort of just go and sit in and, while away the day without anyone bothering you. So there is a certain kind of nostalgia for a certain type of existence which maybe doesn't exist anymore. But that didn't, crucially, that didn't mean he was commenting negatively on the entirety of contemporary society, or saying to people, you don't know what it was like, it was much better back in the day. So he was really engaged with the city he lived in and grew up in, and he was a part of it, and he was interested in it, and he was interested in the people.
Yeah, he was ringing the changes, wasn't he, without being part of the kind of heritage industry of that sort of in some way.
He would have hated any notion of being part of the heritage industry.
That London was always better. Let's sort of fill out the picture a bit by going back in time, because another one of your choices was not actually from London Sound Survey, but is a track which Ian plays on, is part of, and this is The Apostles with Rediffusion Refugee.
Begin, however, with the life and times on Brazilian television, with a short series of films from TV Globo, which were shown last week at the National Film Theatre, alongside work from Czechoslovakia, Germany, India, and Australia.
Apostle. So you said he was a born Londoner. You also mentioned that he was political, I think an anarchist possibly. So let's fill out the past of Ian Moores, because he had quite a colourful past. I mean, he did a lot of different stuff, quite often connected with music or sound or live events and stuff.
Well, I mean, a lot of this has been filled in for me after the fact. I mean, I was friends with Ian for about last 10 years, but it was only really since he got ill and then subsequently to him dying that I kind of really started to flesh out fully his kind of his backstory. Yeah, that track that you played, The Apostles, Ian's contribution to that was the tape running in the background of the TV. You could hear a TV playing. So he contributed tapes to this group, The Apostles, who were a fairly not very well-known kind of London group who had links to kind of the anarcho-punk movement, obviously which was led by, in terms of music, groups like Crass and the Poison Girls and stuff. And Ian was a really hardcore and anarchist at that point. He ran a fanzine. He had a fanzine for a while called Pigs for Slaughter, which was like the fanzine for the militant anarcho-punk, and he was he regarded people like Crass and other anarcho-punks as kind of liberal pacifists. Now, in his fanzine, he published recipes on how to make Molotov cocktails, for instance.
Okay.
So he was ultra militant, but he was also an activist, So there was a place in Wapping called the Autonomy Centre, which was a DIY space, an early DIY space, mostly involved, anarchist and political groups could use it for free. Ian was like an organiser there, one of the key holders at that centre. So he was very involved in this as a publisher, as an activist. The kind of the London's kind of very underground anarcho-punk scene, and his links to the Apostles were, I think he lived in a squat with one of the members of the Apostles. So. And then later on, he ended up moving up to Scotland. He lived in Glasgow and Edinburgh, where he worked as like a music promoter. He was running the Barrowlands venue, which was the major music venue up in Glasgow. And he also ran a small venue of his own. And he was putting on all kinds of bands like Jesus and Mary Chain, Swans, My Bloody Valentine. So that kind of mid-80s alternative rock type stuff. I think he also worked while he was up there. There was like a local kind of free press, like an anarcho type printing setup, which would print pamphlets and such like for local radical political groups. He worked there, and I think he worked as a typesetter and so on. So he developed quite a kind of strong visual graphic identity while he was up there, which I think you can definitely see in the London Sound Survey website.
I just wasn't aware of writing the recipe for the Molotov cocktail. I mean, that might give the impression that he was a sort of fierce, frightening, kind of alarming person. He was the opposite.
It's really bizarre. It was the complete opposite. It was very strange. Yeah, absolutely. And there was a political dimension to his work on the London Sound Survey. He didn't impose it upon the site. It kind of comes through by osmosis, how it's talking about how the city has changed, the forces of capitalism that are kind of brought to bear on the city, how that has changed public space, private space, the different, the different communities that have built up or moved out of the city and so on.
Certainly in the time I met him, I mean, he did various events with us and he was very generous with his time. I
think he was he was a very generous individual. He was he became he became an expert recordist, as you can tell if you listen to the stuff on the site, self-taught, but then he also shared all his kind of, inside tips on how to get the best out of recording equipment and all this kind of stuff. On the website there's lots of articles that he wrote, or blogs or whatever, about how, if you want to become a recordist, then
I wanted to return to what you're saying about, the way that the sort of politics, as it were, sort of seeps through, because he, and what his preferences were, because on the site too there's various collections from the BBC archive which they'd encouraged him to put up there, and I think he did some work on them and sort of cleaning them up, rescuing them as recordings, technical work, and he put up there. And I remember when he did an event with us, this is the recording that he chose to start with.
Now, everybody always imagines that the flower girls of Piccadilly Circus have got a cry, that they say lovely violets, but I don't think you do say that now, do you?
Well, only if we saw a person is passing and they look at the flowers, we just say violets, lovely violets to them. But, of course, the cry is now dying out.
Well, that's very sad to hear it. But do you mean to say you say lovely violets regardless of the time of year?
Oh, yes. I've got so used to saying it that I say it during the summer when there's no violets in season. Violets, lovely violets, roses and violets. That's some nice violets there. Violets, lovely violets, roses. That's some nice violets there. Violets, lovely roses. That's some nice violets there. Violets, that's some nice roses there. Ah, nice violet, love.
A violet cell at Piccadilly Circus in 1956. And
sounds like a sound piece. You can imagine someone taking that and looping it. Violets, lovely violets, violets, lovely violets, lovely. And then it becomes some kind of, it abstracts into some other kind of thing other than a street cry of some street seller, some hawker on the street.
Yeah, totally. And the reason I think he loved that was that, for all the reasons you said, is that it's got something musical in it and rhythmic, and it's a bit of social documentary, and it was ringing the changes at the time. I think she was the last violet seller at Piccadilly Circus. They got moved on by the police shortly afterwards. Let me just drop another one on you, Tony, and just see you respond to this one.
Well, Mr. Marshall, tell us all about selling muffins in the old days.
Oh, when I was 13 years of age, I went out of a Sunday and I used to sell out all right. They used to sell pretty fair in those days.
But there must have been a lot of competition then, wasn't there?
Oh, they was, but still none of them over there. I sold them. I suppose being young, I suppose they come after me for them.
I bet they were good muffins.
Oh, they was, yes. Very good.
Well, now tell me, in the old days, your father used to sell muffins.
Yes, yes.
Now, didn't he
travelled the country.
Did he?
Yes. Same as I did.
Tell me, didn't he have a call or a cry or something?
Yes.
You didn't just... Well, what was it?
Very seldom he hollered out. He hollered out, "Any old crumpets muffins home." That's all he used to holler out.
Could we have that again? What was it?
Yeah. "Any old crumpets muffins home." That's what he used to holler out.
I thought your father also had a little rhyme. Not only that he sang, but he spoke, didn't he?
Yes.
What was it?
Now, ladies and gents, there's a nice little train. If you're only buy off the Muffin Man in the street."
That's the Muffin Man, and the reason I play that, right, is that like the violet cellar, it was this little snapshot of a sort of passing time. I mean, muffins, I think, are like crumpets or some sort of bakery items, and the guy would buy them from the bakery and then take them and sell them on the street. You know, that was a kind of whole economy that was dying out in London. And then it was followed by this. I remember Ian playing this one out.
Are these people playing the Muffin Man over there? Would you tell me how that game goes?
First of all, there's a circle. One person dances round like wooden steps, right round till the end of the song's finished. And then you go to a partner, and then to the end, like wooden steps, you dance.
You sort of sit opposite your partner, both doing wooden soldier steps?
Yes.
I see.
And then you go dance round like wooden steps, right round to the end of that song's finished. And you go on like that till the end of the song.
Now, does that mean that when two people go round in the middle, they stop opposite two people?
Yes.
And sort of sit to do with these two people?
Yes.
And then what happens after that?
Then you go on like that till the end of the song's finished.
I see, and then the four people go round in pairs and they stop opposite four people and dance to them.
Yes.
Now, shall we go over and watch them at it?
Yes.
What do you reckon of that?
Yeah, well, I recognise that song, you know. I'm old enough to recognise, to come in on the tail end of a lot of these things as they were kind of passing into history, you know. Whether it's... I think one thing Ian was interested in was kind of street life and how that had changed, you know. And all these things you're playing there, these kind of streets, the Violet Cellar, the Muffin Man, the kids playing games in the street. I think a lot of that, these, you know, it's basically... very active, it's communal, it's community-based. It's a lot of interaction between different types of individuals on the street. So I think he was kind of, if there's any mournful or forlorn aspect to the London soundscape, I think it's lamenting the passing of street life. You know, he liked markets and all that, as you said when you read out the first. That kind of what were the things he said about maybe why he started the site. Part of it, he wanted to just document this history of stuff on the street, you know?
Yeah.
And also you can't get away from the class aspect, which is made quite stark there, because you have the BBC presenters with the received pronunciation, and then you have, you know, the kind of the people they're speaking to sound like Londoners, you know. So there is a class aspect to this where working class communities the streets around working class communities were very active, full of people. People were outside doing all kinds of things, playing, working and so on. Whereas in other communities of London, like I don't think Ian necessarily recorded around places like St John Wood or St John's Wood, you know, because there's nothing to record there because there's no one on the street.
And as you said, you can dig in. I mean, because of his graphics, it is a very lovely looking site, and there's different ways to explore it. You can explore it by theme, so you can look through those kind of archive recordings, or you can click on the map and find out recordings that were, say, recorded in Camden. You know, there's a whole sequence of them. I'm going to play another one of yours, Tony. I'm just going to play a bit of it, and then we can talk about it. That was from the Thames LP, and it was the Tower Bridge North Bascule Chamber, one of Tony's choices. Why, Tony? And tell us about what is the Bascule Chamber.
Well, I've actually been down there. It's amazing. It is literally this huge underground concrete cavern underneath Tower Bridge. And if you think about when Tower Bridge raises up, each side of the bridge raises up. To counter the weight of the bridge as they raise up, there are these massive, huge, absolutely vast steel counterweights under the bridge. And obviously as the bridge raises up, the counterweights need somewhere to go, so they basically slide into this massive underground cavern. And what you heard was the sound of Tower Bridge being raised from inside the cavern. So it's actually a terrifying space. It's almost like something out of The Pit and the Pendulum. You can imagine an Edgar Allan Poe type horror story being set down there as people are just, laid out as the massive weight comes around to crush them. Or maybe just that's my imagination. So it was very. So it's another example of what Ian was about. I think it's finding a space and recording a sound that otherwise would be. Wouldn't be heard by people, but is very integrated into the workings of a very visual aspect of the city, which is namely the raising of Tower Bridge. So it's a different aspect of that thing, that the raising of Tower Bridge. But it's interesting as you were playing it. Even though I know it, I'm thinking it sounded to me like a work of contemporary orchestral music. Maybe a kind of post John Cage type thing that you would you could hear at Cafe Oto or the Barbican or something like that. It had a very musical aspect to it.
This would not sound out of place if it was played as some live piece of sound art or a bit of improvisation, would it? And it's quite beautiful, certainly at the beginning. It gets much more threatening and picks up on some of the atmosphere you talk about later on. So he was in some way sort of archaeologist of sound as well, wasn't he? Because these were secret, maybe not secret spaces, but rather inaccessible spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's that aspect to it as well, kind of making audible or amplifying sounds that you would otherwise have not heard, other field recordists go into that in a much more detailed way. Someone like Chris Watson, who's probably the most famous field recordist, David Attenborough's recordist, who figures out how do I record inside a termite hill, a mound or whatever, But so Ian wasn't that kind of microscopic recordist. He was much more of a kind of ambient, environmental recordist, if you like. But in the round, when I first met him, around about 2012, he'd started to become involved with a number of musicians in London's kind of experimental music community. Interest in field recordings and sound art had become quite had increased quite a lot. A lot of colleges and institutions were offering courses in sound art or listening studies. A lot of people started talking about listening as part of almost pre or parallel mindfulness type notion. Listening is rather than kind of projecting onto people, you basically listen.
Active listening, as it were. Active
listening, but also listening as in improving your communication and so on. So basically sound art and field recording, partly because the equipment to make field recording possible, it had improved. It was much more discreet. You didn't have to walk around with massive boom microphones and such like. That recording you just played was put out on an LP on a label called Persistence of Sound, which was run by a composer called Ian Chambers. But Ian Chambers himself kind of started incorporating some of Ian's recordings into his own compositions, and Ian started to forge relationships with musicians or organisations that were putting on music. So he started doing talks. The first time I met him was at a talk that I put on at Cafe Oto, for instance. We were talking about sound maps, which were quite a kind of unknown esoteric thing back then. Maybe they still are, actually. But
I didn't know him very well, but he struck me as somebody who was a kind of very benevolent loner. And it's interesting that you said that you found out a lot more about his backstory, his past, after he died. He was a loner, but in a very sort of engaged way. That's how he seemed to me. What was he like as your landlord?
He was hilarious, you know. So he wasn't a commercial landlord, let's say that. So basically he had this flat in New Cross. He got made redundant by the National Sound Archive. So he put the money into doing his flat up in New Cross. And then he was going to rent it out to a mate of his. And then I appeared. I needed to move out of the flat that I'd been living in for 12 years with my daughter. So I was looking for a place for me and my daughter to live. I heard from someone that Ian had a flat. So I got in touch with him anyway, whatever. And one thing led to another, and we eventually, after a couple of months, we moved in. Me and my daughter moved in there, and it was a really nice, big 1-bedroom, which I turned into a 2-bedroom flat. He was going to let it out to me for $900 a month, when he could have got $1,600. And then the day I moved in, he says, "Oh yeah, Tony. Well, Tony, I just thought I'm going to knock £50 off the rent, right? So we're going to charge you $8.50. And the reason for that is, Tony, I will show you." And he took me into the hall, and he showed me a patch of, he'd done some plastering, and it was a bit rough, you know. It was all right. You wouldn't notice it. And he goes, "I was looking at this plastering, Tony, and I'm thinking it's a bit rustic, So consider that a rustic plaster discount, £50."
He was just looking for a way to knock something off the rent. That
yeah,
was all,
so
wasn't it?
I mean, he was, yeah, so, you know, and he said, "Well, I hope you'll stay here a long time, Tony. I hope you'll be very happy." And I think for that reason, let's agree that we'll leave the rent as it is for the next 5 years, and then we'll have another chat about it.
Amazing.
So that's what he did. So yeah, I lived there for 5 years, and I did move out before he died, actually, and one of my colleagues at The Wire moved in. So, you know, he's provided a roof for at least 2 separate workers at The Wire to live under. You know, so
that was his contribution to The Wire as well.
That was partly his contribution to The Wire. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one way or another, I'm in his debt. You know.
Yeah.
I mean, I miss him greatly. You know. I mean, obviously other people were closer to him than I was, but he was one of these people who just seemed to have acquired huge amounts of knowledge purely out of interest in things and stuff and people. And you know, very often you'd have a conversation with Ian, and you know, so you'd mention something, and he'd start off, you know, "Well, Tony, that's very interesting. You should say that because, you know." And then
that's what he sounded like.
Yeah, then he'd drop some kind of science on you or whatever, which was really fascinating, you know. And so he wasn't talking about himself. He could talk forever about multiple subjects,
but not about himself.
About himself. So he was very self-effacing in that way, you know. Because of working for The Wire, a lot of the bands or groups or music that The Wire writes about was the kind of stuff that Ian had been promoting back in the day. So obviously we'd talk a bit about music in that sense, and so I knew he'd worked up in Glasgow and Edinburgh as a promoter and that, but I didn't know about the links to the anarcho movement down here. I didn't know anything about his early days growing up in London for hours and hours and hours, but he was one of these few people who actually very rarely spoke about himself or his own experiences other than...
So he died last year, and I don't know whether this was connected, but in 2020 he also sort of put a cap, as it were, on the London Sound Survey, and all the recordings, the site is still up, but also all his recordings are collected at the London Metropolitan Archive as well, as a sort of... but he did carry on doing stuff, and the next thing we're going to hear in a minute, actually, is from a project that he was working on called The Listening Trail. But do you know why he ended it, Tony, and what happened next between that and him and his death?
Partly because he moved out of London. His partner lived in Cambridge, and I think that was probably the main reason, just that he wasn't here doing the recordings and stuff, you know. The project that you referenced that we're going to hear a recording of, The Listening Trail, that was basically what he started doing instead or afterwards, which was basically a series of sound walks around Cambridge and the surrounding areas, you know, the Fens and that, a very, very different environment to London, obviously. You know, this is mostly rural areas that he's kind of going into and recording and talking about as he's walking through these spaces and making the recordings as well. And so he's left all this stuff behind. This is the things that he was working on just shortly before he died. You know, I think the recording we're going to hear, but he made it in July, you know, and he was dead by September. So,
and also we can hear his voice in this.
Walking along Euston Road, heading south. It's fairly busy with traffic, cars, light vans. As I walk south, to my left or to the east is a place called the Shadwell Estate. One of the roads is marked private, and it's given over to pig farms, an enormous expanse of pig farms. The pigs are rooting around in the churned up ground outdoors, and they have what look like Nissen huts to sleep in. It looks a bit, really almost very far, perhaps half a mile or a mile. It extends like a prisoner of war camp. The prisoners kept in a degraded and naked condition, but otherwise seemingly oblivious to their fate. To my right, to the west, is the grounds of the Nunnery Stud. That's Nunnery Stud Farm, with a huge impressive gateway built in 1988.
There he is.
Yeah, there he is. So, I mean, you know, just that, you obviously, just from that very, very brief example, you've got someone who is incredibly alert to his environment, has an ability to describe it in a way that is very evocative and pictorial, but also is obviously very interested in why this space is here. He notices a gate and he immediately notices that it was built in 88 and so on. So that says a lot about him.
And that project is going to come, I think, with his friends and I think with The Wire.
Yeah, the idea is to do something at some point. Obviously, it's a huge amount of work for somebody to kind of actually index and put all this stuff together. I'm not really giving anything away. You know, he was diagnosed with a very advanced brain tumour, and he went downhill very quickly. So, you know, from being diagnosed to actually dying, it was only a matter of weeks. So there was very little time, and he was like anyone, you know, brain tumours are terrible things because they render people physically. You know, they just slowly shut everything down, so you can't speak or anything like this. You're still cognizant mentally, but you can't communicate, which was incredibly frustrating. But he was still trying to show everyone, you know, he had his computer there and he was sort of trying to show people where the files were and what they were, and he was trying to communicate about all this kind of stuff. Hopefully The Wire will be able to host. And I think the Sound Survey website is going to continue as well, you know.
Great. And for listeners, I will put a link to Tony's obituary of Ian in the show notes. You can check out the London Sound Survey site at www.soundsurvey.org.uk. You will find many of the sounds that we played out here in their full form, along with the sonic treasure trove that Ian collected over 10 years. We didn't get a chance to mention Ian's book, Honk, Conk and Squack It, fabulous and forgotten sound words from a vanished age of listening. Are you the audile sort, I think audile means audio lover, who can tell the difference between a bottle bump and a gabble ratchet? Does your dog oof, baff, channa, snook or wink? Have you been kept awake by a box of toys from a rendezvous, a schlemmozzle, a callet hump, or even a bobbity pack? Or has a dose of the old gin and fog made you all reesty-cropped and gurag like a hinch in Arthur? The answers are in the pages of Ian's book, Honk, Conk and Squack It, a unique collection over 1,500 forgotten and obscure sound words, drawn from old sources across the English-speaking world. It's terrific. Tony, we're getting towards the end and we're going to finish in a minute with your final choice. And this was a piece that was played at his funeral, right? And I think as listeners will hear, there is something very haunting about it. And that must have been quite a moment, I imagine, when this was played. So tell us what it is and something about it. The Herrington Oil refinery siren at Canvey Island.
Yeah, well, it's one of the great field recordings for me, regardless of the circumstance. But again, yeah, Canvey Island, you know, obviously off the coast of, you know, near Southend, historically an area of oil refineries and so on. I think Ian heard that the refinery was being shut down, and so this recording is all that's left of it now. This sound does not exist anymore. I've never heard anything quite like it. It was played at his funeral. Of course, in that context, you know, it was particularly poignant to hear it.
We're going to play out on that, but before we do, I just wanted to read you some of Ian's final words from the London Sound Survey website. And he says that pleasure and curiosity have been the most reliable motivators, more so than a desire to document a city which just sounds pompous. It was also my way of capturing fragments of everyday experience so they could be reproduced in the mind of others. Copies of the site's recordings have been lodged with the London Metropolitan Archives for long-term safekeeping, and so it may be that someone decades hence will come across them. To that future listener, greetings. That was Ian Rawes, and that was Tony Herrington. Thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture to talk about Ian and London Sound Survey, Tony.
It was my pleasure. Hopefully I've done right by Ian.
I think so. Thanks very much, Tony. Thank you to the BBC Archive for their recordings, and to Steve Feld for his recording of Bells and Landscapes. And thank you for listening and spending time with the Bureau of Lost Culture. You can check out all that we do at thebureauoflostculture.com. See you, hear you next time. This one's for Ian Rawes, RIP, the Canvey Island Oil Refinery.